What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun, end quote. This is an old adage, which in the era of nostalgia bait everything we live in, has taken on a new insight for me. I first started contemplating it when the remake for the live-action How to Train Your Dragon movie was announced a few years ago. Now, How to Train Your Dragon is easily one of my favorite movies of all time. But despite my love for the franchise, when the new remake was announced, I wasn't filled with excitement like a lot of my peers. I was filled with dread and, to be honest, mild loathing. I didn't want another big studio ruining a movie I love for a cash grab. In the intervening time, the movie has come out and the reviews are great. Everyone from critics to fans really like the new movies. Cries that DreamWorks has done something Disney could never do and made an actually good remake have gone up, and the box office numbers prove it. But despite all that, I still haven't seen the new live-action How to Train Your Dragon movie, nor do I ever plan to. Because none of the trailers, glowing reviews, or conversations I've had with people can explain or answer one very simple question. Why? Why does this new movie need to exist? What is so wrong with the original that it needs to be done over again? I want to try and answer this question today. Not for How to Train Your Dragon, I haven't seen it, but in a more general sense. Why do we remake stories? I think this is a worthwhile question to try to answer for two main reasons. First, as you've probably noticed, we're in an era where it seems every new project coming out is a remake, a reboot, an adaptation, a belated sequel, or a spin-off of some kind. And while all of these vary wildly in tone, genre, style, length, and especially in quality, I think it is worthwhile to look at the artistic merits of any given trend. But secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, because while remaking stories is a fairly new trend, it isn't a new concept. The Cinderella remake, the movie which prompted all of Disney's live-action remake trends, came out over a decade ago. Plenty of movies were remade or adapted in the 80s and the 90s. When talking films were first becoming popular, most of them were based on popular novels at the time. And for centuries, the main form of entertainment people had were plays, which in a way is just different people performing the same story over and over and over again in slightly different ways. And if you go back far enough, the argument can be made that Virgil's Aeneid, one of the single most influential works in all of Western canon, is just a Roman remake of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. In fact, in an even broader sense, there isn't such a thing as an original story at all. Every idea comes from somewhere, and every trope, archetype, plot structure, and character arc has been done over 1,000,000 times already. What makes stories unique is the specific stance or perspective the story takes, and the unique way that the story will take a jumble of different already known ideas and mix them together into something new. But that doesn't exactly explain why we seem to be so entrapped by remaking and redoing specific properties and franchises. Yes, the easier answer is because it makes money. And yeah, it is a safer bet, both for consumers and for studios, to go with a movie that's already successful rather than to risk money on something new. However, while that answers the logistical reason of why remakes are made and watched, it doesn't answer the artistic purposes of remaking stories, which again is what I'm interested in answering today. Before I continue though, I do want to be clear, and I want you to keep in mind that unless I'm referring to something specific, whenever I say remakes or remaking a story, I'm not just referring to remaking movies, but also reboots, adaptations, sequels, spin-offs of TV shows, films, books, video games, anything that involves taking an existing IP and doing it over again in some way. Nowadays, it seems that an IP can't be forgotten for more than 2 seconds before someone is trying to redo it again. And if the headlines decrying Hollywood as unoriginal or anything to go off of, audiences are growing tired of it. Yet, these remakes still make money, gobs of money. People pay to see stories they've already seen before. Moreover, people refuse to let these remakes make any sort of changes to their source material that would result in a different story. I was once having a conversation with a friend debating the artistic value of remakes, and he argued that remakes that don't make any changes to the source material are better for fans, because then fans won't be disappointed by any changes that are made. This is an argument a lot of people seem to agree with, But I have one main question in response. Why not just rewatch the original? If the entire purpose of a remake is to make no changes to the source material and transfer the old story into the new story as closely as possible, what is the purpose of doing it at all? Especially since it isn't that hard to find the original content. In the era of streaming, you can put on a movie from your couch with 3 clicks of your remote. Sometimes streaming sites you're subscribed to don't have the specific movie you're looking for, in which case you hop in your car, drive 5 minutes to the Weston Library, and there's a really good chance they'll have a DVD copy of it. So, if you can enjoy the original story from the comfort of your own home with extreme convenience and at times literally for free, what's the point in shelling out $20 to go to the theater to watch that same exact movie? A movie you've probably already seen and probably already love. The reason is we don't want remakes that are the same as the original. We want to see something new. We believe that whatever changes a remake makes, condensing a TV show into a movie, changing mediums, or even something as simple as recasting, will offer a new experience. That even if those changes aren't inherently better, they will have a type of inherent value simply because they are different. But when we critique changes simply because they are changes, we are limiting the value that a remake can offer us. Yes, the more changes the story makes, the more of a risk it is. The higher the chance that those changes are artistically bad. But again, without any changes whatsoever, there's no reason to watch the new story at all. The issue isn't so much whether a remake makes changes, but what the story changes. I've noticed 3 general types of changes a remake makes: unintentional changes, confined intentional changes, and then complete rewrites. If I were to make a painting, that painting would have a sort of inherent value just because it exists. Value in the cost of materials I made it with, or value in the time and effort I put into making that painting. However, that doesn't mean the painting is good. Similarly, we watch remakes because they're different, because change is inherently valuable. However, just because a change exists doesn't mean that change is good or bad or has artistic merit. The audiences want to limit the amount of artistically draining changes in the remakes they enjoy, so they try to limit as many changes as possible. But again, changes are inherent in a remake. So what ends up being limited isn't the changes themselves, but the artistic value of those changes. In 1998, director Gus Van Sant released his shot-for-shot remake of Alfred Hitchcock's 1960s film Psycho, one of the most influential thriller films of all time. Van Sant did everything in his power to make his movie as close as possible to the original. But if you look at reviews, Hitchcock's Psycho is considered a genuine masterpiece, while Van Sant's Psycho is considered an absolute, unadulterated failure. These are, for all intents and purposes, the same movie. So what went wrong? Well, there isn't just one reason behind the film failing, but as you can probably guess, most of the reasons came about not despite the fact that Van Sant was following a great movie so closely, but because of that fact. A lot of changes that Van Sant made weren't genuine artistic decisions, but rather unavoidable alterations, such as adding color, the new cast, or re-recording the music, all of which backfired and actually made the film worse. In art, any art, the vast majority of what you see in the end result is deliberate. Everything as big as when the act breaks are, to something as small as the lens choice or wording of a sentence. Artists are very deliberate about their craft. However, that isn't to say that everything in a story is always intentional. Sometimes something slips past the creator's notice, and sometimes that is to the detriment of the story. For instance, plot holes. I don't think anyone sets out to write a nonsensical plot. Plot holes typically happen when an author isn't paying attention to the right things and no one corrects it. But sometimes a detail you noticed in a book or a film that adds so much to the story is something the author didn't even think of. As Bob Ross would call them, these are happy accidents. When parts of the story just sort of fit together and work out without the author consciously making it so. But there is also such a thing as plain mistakes in art. Again, like plot holes. Now, typically, the more experienced a creator is, the more they'll have a solid enough foundation of their craft that the blips which slip past them will end up being happy accidents rather than plot holes. And since the creator is still making their project, since the end goal is still a hazy point in the future, they can use those accidents, happy or complete failures, consciously or subconsciously, to change course and make a better end product. For instance, the pivotal "I am Iron Man" line from Iron Man 1 was an improvised line by Robert Downey Jr. that the director liked enough to leave in the final cut. When the overarching artistic vision isn't the creator's, though, whenever an artist is being inorganically contained to a story they don't fit well with, the more accidents are going to slip past, and the fewer of those accidents are going to be beneficial to the story. In a similar way, this is one of my main problems with the Disney live-action remakes. Usually, the main change these remakes offer is the medium change from animation to live action. A lot of people, mainly big studios, seem to think that animation and live action are both visual mediums of film, and thus they're interchangeable. Or worse, that animation is simply the for kids version of film. Now that's an entire essay in and of itself, but suffice it to say that both of those stances are rather incorrect. Animation and live action, while similar, are both distinct storytelling mediums with different strengths. A lot of children's media is animated because the strengths of animation with these stories line up more with the strengths that children have. They're very creative and very exaggerated. But that doesn't mean all animation is fundamentally only for kids, or that it doesn't have any unique strengths in and of itself. The strength of animation is that it is more stylized than live action. I mean, you can bend and stretch realities in ways that feels believable. So when an animated story is transferred into a live action story, even stylized live action, it doesn't feel right. Unless you lean into the new medium in very specific ways, which often ends up changing the story, the new film ends up looking very flat and awkward compared to the original. But a lot of the live action remakes market themselves or are seen as grown-up versions of the original animated stories, just because they're live action. And all that does is insult and misrepresent the medium of animation and the original story, which chose to be told through animation. Of course, that isn't the only change these remakes offer, nor is it the main one that people take issue with. Yes, the Disney remakes do make changes. They'll add scenes and subplots, change dialogue, and of course, change the medium from animation to live action. But the writers can't do anything drastic in order to maintain the childhood nostalgia and recognizability of the original story, which I'll talk about in a minute, but this is the second main point: confined changes. See, the major plot beats and character arcs need to stay the same, at least on the surface. However, this means that the writers are artificially confined to the story they don't want to tell. So the changes that the writers end up making relate to the actual content of the scenes. For instance, consider Beauty and the Beast. The original is another one of my favorite films of all time that gets absolutely butchered by the remake. One of the best examples of this is the library scene, which has already been critiqued a lot, and nothing I'm about to say is original, ironically. So I'll try and keep it brief. But in the 1991 movie, Beast and Belle had just saved each other's lives and had started to grow close. Beast wants to do something genuinely kind for Belle, not because they're in love, but because he's becoming friends with her, and he wants to show his appreciation of her. And knowing that she loves to read, he decides to give her his entire library, just because he thinks she'll enjoy it. It's a selfless gift, and in this scene, you can see the pure joy on both of their faces. Both on Belle's face when she receives the gift, and on Beast's face when he sees that he's made her happy. Now, if you compare this to the remake, the plot points are generally similar. The two save each other's lives, and then they get into a bickering match where Beast insults Belle's literary taste and drags her down to his library, saying she'll find something better there so that she can get to his literary level, and only gives her the library as an awkward afterthought. Maybe they're not too similar. From a plot point perspective, both of these scenes are the same. Beast and Belle save each other, Beast gives Belle the library, they're both happy. But the actual content of the scene is drastically different, and that affects the quality of the film as a whole. Most discussions surrounding remakes don't center on which story is better, but rather whether the remake has failed miserably or able to justify its own existence. Remakes aren't striving for artistic excellence. They're just trying to avoid being artistic failures. And all of this brings us back to How to Train Your Dragon. Now, as I've already said, I haven't seen the new remake. I can make absolutely no judgments about its quality. However, from the very first poster that came out, I knew the remake would be copying the original. When the first trailers were coming out, they made very prominent use of all the famous shots and all the famous scenes and all the famous lines from the original movie. I had a friend tell me that he was excited to see the new remake because everything he had heard said the remake was just like watching the original all over again. In a promotional video talking about the music, John Powell, the composer, said that if he did his job right, no one would be able to notice a difference, even though it would be there. So yeah, maybe the changes the remakes make are subtle, but in a good way. But that still isn't enough for me to get excited for it. I've already seen the original a dozen times, and I love it as is. More than that, I've read the original books and think the movie was a complete missed opportunity. If you've read the original books, you've probably had to put them down after the first chapter and double check whether you're reading the right series, because Cressida Cowell's original novels and the movies are almost nothing alike. The movie took the general premise of what if Vikings had dragons, a few of the character names, and dropped virtually every other element of the story in order to write something entirely new. Except, admittedly, that's a bit of a misrepresentation. Because the movie kept the tone and theme of the books, a coming-of-age story about a young boy using his brains and kindness to succeed in a society that doesn't value those things. The movie kept the core of the original books and elaborated on it in a new way in order to create a new story. And all of this brings us to what makes for a good remake. Good remakes don't so much remake the original story as reimagine it. And this is something that we see more in adaptations than straight up remakes, because the medium shift from book to TV show, game to movie, or book to game has such a fundamental impact on the way that the story is told, changes have to be made. Internal monologues need to find a way to be conveyed visually. Scenes need to be cut for time. The story needs to be told in a different way, which means the story needs to be different. While there aren't as many good examples of remakes as there are of good adaptations, there are a few hidden gems. In 1934, Alfred Hitchcock released The Man Who Knew Too Much, a film which follows a man who gets swept up in an assassination plot when his daughter is kidnapped by foreign terrorists. The black and white film stars Leslie Banks and Peter Lorre and clocks in at a runtime of an hour and 15 minutes, despite feeling much shorter. And Hitchcock wasn't happy with it. At least that's my best guess, because in 1956, Hitchcock remade the movie entirely. The new version starred Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day in color and was 45 minutes longer than the original for a total runtime of 2 hours. And while the general premise is still the same, the 56 version is a very different take on that premise. The first movie had a far more passive protagonist, and a tone that felt almost campy at times. I mean, when the protagonist finds the foreign spies who've kidnapped his daughter masquerading as sun worshippers, he sits down and starts having tea and scones with them. The 56 movie, on the other hand, is far more serious, with a tone so tense it feels, at times, claustrophobic, in a good way. And while I never really cared for it, that's essentially what Virgil did with his Aeneid. He took two very famous and influential works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and used their structures and events to craft his own story, which centered on his own character and plot. My favorite remake of all time is the 2015 Cinderella film, because it's less of a remake of the 1960 film and more of a retelling of the original fairy tale that is heavily influenced by the 1960 version of the story. The movie adds depth and layers to characters and to the story rather than obsessively trying to redo what has already been done. but the film still manages to keep the core of the original story the same. And if you think about it, what are all of those Disney movies that are being remade? They're retellings of fairy tales. Those movies are remakes in and of themselves. Although, to be fair, the Cinderella remake was in a slightly different spot than a lot of these newer remakes are. See, Cinderella, the 1960 film, was a far simpler and more direct adaptation of the fairy tale, so there was a lot of room for the 2015 version to extrapolate on the story, more than, say, Aladdin. And there probably weren't as many people who had nostalgia for the original film and would be willing to see it solely for that purpose. A lot of remakes coming out now, however, are nostalgia bait, pure and simple. That's why a lot of the properties being remade are from the 80s and the 90s. That is the era most adults who would pay money to go to the theater grew up in and have nostalgia for. Which is perhaps another reason why the How to Train Your Dragon remake felt so off to me. It was nostalgia bait aimed at my generation. And it was weird to see all of my peers fall head over heels for this marketing trick that until this point had only been something I had seen and witnessed in generations above me. Why do we remake stories? It's because we crave the familiar, and remakes offer us the chance to do something with the stories we already know and love, to combine our love with the familiar with our desire for the novel. The real question is, why do we keep settling for remakes that poorly repackage those stories into hollow shells of their former selves without offering anything new to us? Hi, I'm Daphne Pulsone. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch. If anything I said today tickles your fancy and you think I was right or wrong, you can find all the stories I mentioned at the Weston Public Library, and then you can tell me whether you think I was right or I was wrong, or whether you think I should have mentioned any other remakes.